Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests those settlers who first landed on New Zealand did so by the end of the 13th century. It had a different name then, Aotearoa, meaning land of the long white cloud, originally just representing the North Island. As chance would have it, this turned out to be the very last significant landmass to be colonised by humans anywhere on the planet. This being, in fact, one of the very last exploratory expeditions of Polynesians anywhere. The tradition of great seagoing voyages having fallen out of custom by around the 14th century. Nevertheless, in time, that clan, or perhaps groups of clans, who didn't arrive at their destination until the High Middle Ages, would grow to become one of the most populous Polynesian islands of all, numbering some 100,000 people by the time they were discovered by Europeans on the verge of the Victorian era. We know them today as the Maori, the first people to reach New Zealand.
Okay, I said it wrong, so it's Maori. Gotcha. Okay, I will continue to say it correct. Maori. First people in New Zealand. Cool. Alright, this is going to be wonderful. I'm excited. Moving on.
This video is sponsored by Magellan TV, a brand new educational streaming service with over 2,000 documentaries to watch on all manner of different
Hi, Meenan. Hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for being here.
subjects. Magellan's producers and curators have brought together an astounding collection of documentaries on history, science, nature, culture, and geography. These include films, series, and exclusive playlists you can't find anywhere else. Like Netflix, this is a streaming service, but made just for documentary lovers and knowledge seekers. You can watch Magellan anywhere at any time on any device, directly through the high-quality app, which also offers a wide selection of content in 4K at no extra cost. There are no ads or limited access at any time, and the best part, new documentaries are added on a weekly basis. Recently, I've been making my way through Magellan's excellent collection of ancient history documentaries. There's loads to watch on Rome, Egypt, China, and so much more. Those of you who head on over to magellantv.com/historytime or use my link in the description below will get a free trial. So what are you waiting for? Head on over and get yourself some free knowledge.
Well, I'm sold. That's it. You sold me with, especially with that little last part there. Get myself some knowledge. Yeah. Once we're done, I will be definitely checking this app out. Had me at science, and yep. Let's go. Let's do it. Okay, so it's first contact. I'm blocking part of it, so it's 1642 to 1842.
In the year 1768, a solitary British sea vessel glided out onto the vast South Pacific Ocean. She was destined to be the first European ship to make landfall on the islands of New Zealand. Constructed using state-of-the-art new technology, the HMS Endeavour had been commissioned on behalf of the Royal Navy to undertake a voyage of scientific inquiry and exploration in the area, with a view to locating the long hypothesised continent of Terra Australis, then little more than a blank section on the map. The first Europeans to visit New Zealand had been those of the Dutchman Abel Tasman's crew back in the 17th century. They didn't make landfall, however, and after encountering a hostile reception from some of the natives, they made a swift exit. For the next 128 years, until the arrival of the Endeavour, the place remained an unknown, distant land. The Pacific Ocean covers a third of the entire planet's surface, 165 million square kilometres of unbroken sea, dotted with thousands of islands, archipelagos, volcanic rocks, and coral atolls, along with an eclectic diversity of flora, fauna, and flourishing human societies. The commanding officer of the Endeavour, Captain James Cook, was amazed at the eclectic array of peoples and tribes that he and his crew met as they passed through the region in the latter 18th century, scattered across thousands of miles of open blue. Though these people living on such vastly separate islands as Tonga, Samoa, Easter Island, and Hawaii did have differences, for the most part, it was their similarities that were more noticeable, even though some were completely cut off from the outside world when Cook arrived. How had these people got to islands as far afield as Hawaii and Easter Island, the men wondered. Islands that were thousands of miles away from each other and completely unknown to Europeans until a few decades earlier. Of course, theories would abound in the coming decades of long-lost Pacific-spanning continents sinking under the sea at some point in antiquity, leaving those far-flung islanders presumably clinging on to mountains and highlands as the last survivors. Such was the European disdain for the people they encountered. Of course, the truth was far more amazing than anyone could ever invent. The real origin of these people was the most simple of all. They were all descended from a single seafaring group, known as the Polynesians, separated only by geographical distance and the passing of time. In September 1769, the Endeavour anchored off the coast of New Zealand, becoming the first European vessel to successfully reach the islands since that of Abel Tasman 127 years earlier.
Okay, really quickly, before we continue. So Polynesia is a sub-region of Oceania, made up of more than 1,000 islands scattered over the central and southern Pacific Ocean. The indigenous people who inhabit the islands of Polynesia are called Polynesians. They have many things in common, including language relatedness, cultural practices, and traditional beliefs. In centuries past, they had a strong shared tradition of sailing and using stars to navigate at night. The largest country in Polynesia is New Zealand. The term Polynese was first used in 1756 by the French writer Charles de Brosses, who originally applied it to all the islands of the Pacific. In 1831, Jules Dumont d'Urville proposed a narrower definition during a lecture at the Geographical Society of Paris. By tradition, the islands located in the southern Pacific have also often been called the South Sea Islands, and their inhabitants have been called South Sea Islanders. The Hawaiian Islands have often been considered to be part of the South Sea Islands because of their relative proximity to the southern Pacific Islands, even though they are in fact located in the North Pacific. Another term in use which avoids this inconsistency is the Polynesian Triangle, from the shape created by the layout of the islands in the Pacific Ocean. This term makes clear that the grouping includes the Hawaiian Islands, which are located at the northern vertex of the referenced triangle. Cool. Just wanted to put that out there. Give a little quick explanation on Polynesia, and yeah. Yep. As soon as they said, as soon as British sailors, I was like, yep, I know what that means. I mean, especially being from a country that was conquered by Spain. That's how it all started with the expeditions and, you know, that same thing that you just said, Munin, going to another place and be like, oh, this is mine now, and putting a flag, staking it down, and calling it your own, yet the people that are there, they're just looking at you like, hello? Hi? It's crazy. It is madness. Moving on.
In a 6-month-long encounter, Cook and his crew met with the Maori inhabitants of the region dozens of times, on board his ship and at their settlements. On one occasion, even sailing 20 kilometres inland to meet the tribes of the interior. In truth, the secret of the expedition's success was a Polynesian priest who had been taken aboard as a guide in Tahiti to help in the search for the lost continent. In time, becoming integral as an interpreter. Tupaia could converse on a rudimentary level in both English and Maori, it being a related language to the one that he spoke on Tahiti. And this was likely the reason why Cook's party weren't met with similar levels of hostility as Tasman's had been. For the Maori also had legends of a lost continent. The ancestral homeland in the Pacific their ancestors had first sprung from all those hundreds of years before, known to them as Hiawatha. Tupaia, able to understand his cousins on a rudimentary level, made a significant impact on the Maori, and understandably was seen as a far more important figure than Captain Cook or the gentleman scientist Joseph Banks. If you want to hear Cook's first-hand account of his landing in New Zealand, then you can do so here, over on our second channel, Voices of the Past. And don't forget to subscribe for more historical content. In a tragic, though all too common occurrence, Tupaia died on the return journey in December 1770 from disease. His unique knowledge of pre-European Maori culture and history going out with him. Though Cook hadn't intentioned any particular malice or ill will, over the century to come, tens of thousands of Polynesians would follow Tupaia to the grave. By a combination of disease and devastation as a result of European contact. Cook didn't make it back to Europe either, eventually being killed in Hawaii in 1779. During the course of his 3 voyages and 4 visits to the country, Cook circumnavigated the entirety of New Zealand, spending a total of 328 days off its coast. There had been misunderstandings. In 1773, for example, 10 expedition members were killed and eaten after a particularly deadly encounter with a group of Maori warriors. Nevertheless, on the whole, with the initial help from Tupaia, Cook was as respectful as he could be, introducing numerous areas to the existence of the wider world. By the late 18th century, the Maori population probably stood at around 100,000. Upon the arrival of Europeans, in most areas, day-to-day life didn't change much. It would take some time for the negative impacts of disease and introduced species to become apparent. Though turnips and potatoes introduced by Cook very quickly became staple foods in the areas they were introduced to, and metal began to revolutionise life in others. In time, pigs, metal, and muskets were all introduced, as well as a steady line of sailors, sealers, traders, whalers, and assorted adventurers from Europe, seeking a new life in the wilds of the new continent. Life there would never be the same again. By the beginning of the 1800s, as Christian missionaries began to make significant inroads on the islands, disease began to leave its mark too. Over the span of thousands of years, Europeans had developed hard-won immunities to the many animal-borne epidemics that came with domesticating animals.
Alright, so we'll just read. So wildlife, livestock. Okay, so humans on top. So blue and green, we have Lyme disease, monkeypox, hantavirus, Ebola, and SARS. The middle green intersection between wildlife, livestock, and humans. We have rabies, West Nile virus, tuberculosis, anthrax, tularemia, plague, salmonellosis, avian influenza, and brucellosis. And then on your right hand side, livestock and human, we have bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Have Escherichia coli, E. coli, cowpox, and Rift Valley fever. So, wow. Kind of pretty common when you have, settlers coming from other places, and they bring all that with them. It's the same that happens in the Dominican Republic. It's like hearing history just being repeated in just different places in the world, and it's the same thing. It's just populations of people that were already there being discovered by someone else, and then they just bringing all their crap in with them, and then there's like a whole bunch of diseases and like whatever. So history just repeats. It's history repeating itself in different places, in different instances of time. It's crazy. All right, and then before we move on, and then coincidentally, it's always like the natives of the countries where they go to, like they're the ones that are always they're always given the short end of the stick. My ancestors are, the Tainos. Like, we experienced that. Like, my ancestors experienced that shit. Come on. Exactly, Bunin, in the name of progress. But what is this progress? You feel me? Could you imagine if someone would just go up to your house right now, or just go up to your property and be like, this is mine now? What would you do? You would probably fight back and be like, what the fuck? What are you doing? But then to just like sit back and like accept history like that, and like, yeah, that sucks. But moving on. I mean, it's whatever. It is what it is at this point, but it's good that we're learning. That's the most important part. Again, knowledge is power, and the more we know, the better.
New Zealand had no farm animals, and thus no immunity developed over the generations. As epidemics tore through the native population, the Europeans, known as Pakeha, did not die, leading many Maori to start to wonder whether their gods had abandoned them. Some of them joining with the European missionaries to condemn their own ancestral way of life as devil worship. By the 1840s, 2/3 of Maori had become Christian. With each passing year, more wisdom and knowledge was lost. Yet, cultural amnesia and disease weren't the only danger. By the 1820s, bartering and adaptation by Maori living on the far northern tip of the North Island led to an arms race between the Old World and the New. These tribes, known as Nagapui, came to possess muskets ahead of their rivals, thus sparking off a total escalation of older tribal conflicts known as the Musket Wars. A systematic settling of old scores by groups wielding vastly superior firepower to their neighbours. In the ensuing 30-year bloodbath between 1807 and 1837, some 3,000 battles were fought between Maori tribes, leading to the enslavement of tens of thousands and the deaths of as many as 40,000. From then on, it was a relatively simple affair for the British to trick elements of the Maori leadership into accepting rule by the British Empire by signing the misleading Treaty of Waitangi.
Okay, before it continues, let's read a little bit about the Musket Wars. So, like I said, the Musket Wars were a series of as many as 3,000 battles and raids fought throughout New Zealand, including the Chatham Islands, among Maori between 1807 and 1837. After Maori first obtained muskets and then engaged in an intertribal arms race in order to gain territory or seek revenge for past defeats. The battles resulted in the deaths of between 20,000 and 40,000 people and the enslavement of tens of thousands of Maori, and significantly altered the Roi, or tribal territorial boundaries, before the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. Okay, and then the Treaty of Waitangi is a document of central importance to the history, to the political constitution of the state, and to the national mythos of New Zealand. It has played a major role in the treatment of Maori population in New Zealand by successive governments and the wider population, a role that has been especially prominent from the late 20th century. The treaty document is an agreement, not a treaty as recognized in international law, and it has no independent legal status, being legally effective only to the extent it is recognized in various statutes. It was first signed on the February 6, 1840 by Captain William Hobson as consul for the British Crown, and by Maori chiefs Rangatira from the North Island of New Zealand. The treaty was written at a time when the New Zealand Company, acting on behalf of large numbers of settlers and would-be settlers, were establishing a colony in New Zealand, and when some Maori leaders had petitioned the British for protection against French ambitions. It was drafted with the intention of establishing a British governor of New Zealand, recognizing a Maori ownership of their lands, forests, and other possessions, and giving Maori the rights of British subjects. Yet, again, the treaty document is an agreement, not a treaty as recognized in international law, and it has no independent legal status, being legally effective only to the extent it is recognized in various statutes. Okay. So it's actually, I mean, this treaty, I mean, is of extreme importance to like New Zealand. It's not just like something, because like if you really like dive into like history, there are lots of treaties that have been signed. Many of them don't have, like, they're important, but they're not extremely important to that, like, to this degree. But like, this seems to be something that's, essential to New Zealand's history, yet it's not recognized as what the name is, the treaty. It's insane. All right, moving on.
Yet the Maori did not surrender, not by a long shot. A series of fightbacks continued until well into the 1870s, including numerous embarrassing defeats for the British by outnumbered and outgunned Maori warriors. By this time, however, Europeans almost outnumbered the natives. There would be no going back. Despite their clearly impressive levels of adaptability, the racial stereotyping of Maori began very early on, for this was the era of social Darwinism, usually portraying Maoris as little more than savages. A different type to the allegedly simple ones of Australia, but savages nonetheless. The reality being that Australia simply had no domesticatable animals or plants, meaning the people there remained hunter-gatherers, and New Zealand had very few, leading to the farming society that formed.
Sorry. So social Darwinism refers to various theories and societal practices that purport to apply biological concepts of natural selection and survival of the fittest to sociology, economics, and politics, and which were largely defined by scholars in Western Europe and North America in the 1870s. Social Darwinism holds that the strong see their wealth and power increase while the weak see their wealth and power decrease. Social Darwinist definitions of the strong and the weak vary, and also differ on the precise mechanisms that reward strength and punish weakness. Many such views stress competition between individuals in laissez-faire capitalism, which is an economic system, what I just said in French, in which transactions between private groups of people are free from any form of economic interventionism, such as subsidies deriving from special interest groups. So yeah, so that's what laissez-faire, whatever, capitalism is. And so we continue. So while others, emphasizing struggle between national or racial groups, support eugenics, racism, imperialism, and or fascism. That's part of social Darwinism. It declined in popularity as a purportedly scientific concept following the First World War, and was largely discredited by the end of the Second World War, partially due to its association with Nazism and due to a growing scientific consensus that eugenics and scientific racism were groundless. Later reference to social Darwinism was usually pejorative. So that's social Darwinism for you in a nutshell. And that I just wanted to stop it there because I remember hearing that theory being spoken about. It was a long time ago. I hadn't paid much mind to it, but I remembered it because it was a documentary about World War II. And automatically, once I saw that they mentioned it here in the documentary in regards to the Maori people, and how the British were that theory was being used against the Maori people by the British during this time, social Darwinism. I just had to pause and just kind of read about what that was. It's interesting how even then there were theories and concepts being created to be able to basically control this population of people who they deemed less. Funny how that's a common theme and topic between colonizers and those that are always going into other countries, especially back in the day in history, that would go into countries and conquer. Like, it's always that it's like Munin said, like, in the name of progress, but based off of them being like them thinking that because of their wealth and power that they were less or weak, like social Darwinism explains. Therefore, they felt entitled to that land and ownership of the Maori people, which is the same bullshit that the Spanish conquistadors did to my beautiful country of Dominican Republic, and they did it to my ancestors. So again, it's just history consistently repeats itself in different periods of times, and it wears different masks and different faces, but all in the name. Yeah, it's true. Hey, and even in the name of progress. Crazy. Yeah, but you're right, Munin. It was very rampant, and it was. Yeah. I mean, to create a concept like social Darwinism to be able to control a population of people, that's, yeah, I agree with you, Munin. That's, yeah, definitely very rampant. Okay, we continue.
Many Maori had been relatively quick to adapt to European ways of life. No matter how hard the missionaries tried, however, veneration for the ancestors and the traditions of old could not be rooted out.
Shout out to the Native Americans. Shout out. No, I'm not pointing to them. I'm just pointing here. So, shout out to the Native Americans of the U.S. Yeah, I know why I'm saying this.
Maori were extremely interested in their own past, preserving it through a culture of oral storytelling. A culture which was still very much alive when certain European writers, and Maori who had recently learned how to write, began to document it during the 1800s, solidifying a rich corpus of mythological tales on paper for the next generation.
So it says travelers. It's 100 BC to 1300 AD.
From Easter Island to Tonga, across the vast arc of the Pacific Ocean, is a distance of over 6,500 kilometers. Hawaii is even further. Yet, nevertheless, many of the same legends and stories can be found in these far-off lands. One of the most famous of the bunch is that of Maui, a trickster god, always curious and exploring. The tale has different details and variations from island to island, yet there are several common aspects held between all, with Maui usually said to have pulled up the islands of the Pacific to the surface using his magic fishing hook after going sailing with his brothers one day. This may seem an unusual tale, yet in the context of Polynesia, it makes perfect sense. Travelling hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles without any sight of land, without the help of any modern navigational aids, master navigators would steer with a single large oar, using the ocean current, the planets, the clouds, the moon, the stars and the sun as guides, seeing the ocean not as an obstacle, but as a pathway.
That's crazy. I still get confused sometimes with Google Maps when it tells me, when it gives me like wrong directions. And these people are using like the stars and the moon and all this. That's insane. It's crazy. That's wow. Our ancestors were. That's wow. And I say our because again, like, you know, it was a common theme back in the day. That's what you did. Wow. It's
simply from around 1500 BC, when the ancestors of the Polynesians, fishermen and farmers, left Southeast Asia to make a new life on the wide ocean, there were many Maoris. To those that followed them over the years, ancient wayfinders would have seemed to have done just that, to have essentially plucked land out of thin air on the endless ocean. They still had priestly, sacred associations when Cook arrived in the 18th century. Over the next 1,000 years, the culture and languages of these people took on unique Polynesian aspects, clearly distinguishable by their material culture, often linked to ocean voyaging and colonization. Great double-headed canoes could carry as many as 200 people a short distance, and 100 people as well as supplies for much further.
That's a hefty boat right there. And yeah, I agree with you, Munin. I watch these documentaries and yeah, it reminds me of what my ancestors used to do. Like, they would hunt, they would fish, like they would eat, they would all like probably like hang out. They just lived. They would fuck. They would go into the beach, just swim, just fucking enjoy life. They would live. Well, yeah, we did die younger, but life was rich. I agree with you. The life we lived was richer. That is true. I totally agree with you. And I think that's my definition of true freedom, in my personal opinion. And it's the ability to enjoy this beautiful, beautiful, like, earth, especially back then when it was like wow, I could only imagine, like, there was like no pollution or anything like that. Weren't any machinery or anything. Everything was probably like greener than what we're accustomed to seeing. Everything flourished, and yeah, I can only imagine. I remember the last time I was in Dominican Republic, I was in the beach, I was in the water, and I was having a conversation with someone, and we were talking about that, and it was just like, right, this is what my ancestors used to do. Like, they used to just chill on the beach and shit, and they would get out and probably catch some fish, cook it, or fire, dude. Probably did some mushrooms and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think about all those things, and I do agree with you. I do agree with you, Minion. Alright, moving on.
Don't know what prompted these people to leave their homelands. Whether it was the result of conflict, societal pressures, or simply the innate human desire to travel, carried within us all from our hundreds of thousands of years wandering on the open savannah. But we do know that the benefits for those who succeeded were impressive. The Pacific was the last major region on Earth to be peopled by humans. Around 2,000 years ago, led by master navigators journeying to distant lands over the sunrise, it was Samoan explorers who set out across the vast ocean to the east. Here, the islands are much more scattered and smaller than those they travelled from. Volcanic and coral atolls dotted over enormous expanses of water. Common must have been the journey that reached no end. Especially careful organisation was needed, and whilst some islands maintained contacts with each other, others would never hear from their relatives again, remaining completely isolated in their new homes. Taking with them coconut, breadfruit, paper mulberry, pandanus, taro, yams, gourd, kumara, dogs, pigs, edible rats, and fowl. Everything needed to start a new civilization.
Crazy how now seeing this, like, and the different types of foods and vegetables that were taken with them, like, albeit it has different names, dude, a lot of these things grow in DR as well, and we eat them. Like, it's like common for us to eat, and I'm not saying that there's any like relation between like them and us, but it's just like it's pretty coincidental. I mean, we're all I come from an island, and this is all small islands that form this this part of the earth, Polynesia, but all those small islands that you can see up here, and it's just crazy how coincidental like it is. Like, again, different names, but wow, that's human beings for you. And I guess that's Earth for you too as well, we can say. Interesting.
In recent years, those early Polynesian explorers and settlers responsible for populating the entire Pacific Ocean have been called Vikings of the Pacific. But in reality, long before sails were ever adopted in Scandinavia, Polynesians were embarking on some of the greatest voyages of exploration ever undertaken by humans. Though often isolated from one another, parts of the Pacific had once been a giant interconnected system, joined together by the greatest seafarers who ever lived. Men and women who traversed thousands of miles of open sea with nothing to guide them save the ocean, the wind, and the sky. Expeditions required astonishing skills and levels of wayfinding which are lost today. The culture of voyaging gradually disappearing over the years as each island adopted a new culture. By the 16th century, major voyages seem to have mostly ceased. We know of these journeys by the very existence of the island nations themselves, and from oral tradition, written observances of Europeans, archaeological evidence on items such as petroglyphs, and by trying them out for ourselves. Midway through the 20th century, a certain level of skepticism still existed around the exploits of ancient Polynesians. Norwegian writer Thor Heyerdahl took it upon himself to not only prove these naysayers wrong, but further to demonstrate that Polynesians may have even made it to America. A prospect hinted at by the existence of a South American sweet potato in the larder of certain Polynesians, and small amounts of genetic evidence too.
Holy cannoli, Munin, and you just mentioned it right now. Some say these are also the people who populated Chile, and subsequently South America. He just mentioned it right now. Crazy. I did not know that. I did not know that at all. The more you know. Because, like it says all the way at the corner, knowledge is power. The more you know, the better. Thanks, Munin, for saying that. It's crazy. It's crazy. I would have known. I didn't. Wow. Some say these are also the people who populated Chile and subsequently South America. Wow.
Between April and August 1947, Heyerdahl completed his journey on the Kon-Tiki from South America to Hawaii, using only traditional techniques and a Polynesian canoe. In the 1970s, another similar expedition was successfully launched, when a vessel named the Hokulea travelled from Hawaii to Tahiti using only traditional Polynesian techniques, sparking off a renaissance of interest in the old ways. Interest that culminated most recently in 2017, when the Hokulea completed a worldwide voyage using old techniques. A 3-year circumnavigation of the Earth, covering some 47,000 nautical miles. It was sometime in the 13th century, at the very end, but perhaps pinnacle of this period of expansion, that a similar canoe to this first made landfall in the islands we know today as New Zealand.
Okay, so it's first people circa 1300 to 1450. I know you used to follow them on Insta. Oh, that's pretty cool, Munin. It seems like that would be a very interesting account to follow. Is that the name? Hokulea? I'll check him out.
Until relatively recently, the colonisation of New Zealand was thought by many to have occurred as early as the 10th century, led by a Polynesian navigator named Kupe. Only some 400 years later, then being followed by a great fleet of Maori canoes, who displaced the previous Maori people. Though there may have indeed been a navigator named Kupe, a figure spoken of by many myths all over the islands, the rest of the tale, still taught in schools until well into the second half of the 20th century, is a complete myth. largely invented by Europeans, and then eventually adopted by Maori through the education system. In reality, there is no evidence whatsoever for one group of earlier settlers who were then displaced by the Maori of the Great Fleet in 1350. The tale, in fact, being favoured to a certain degree as it justified subsequent British claims over New Zealand.
Why am I not surprised? So, Kupe was a legendary Polynesian explorer, navigator, and great rangatira of Hawaii, who is said to have been the first human to discover New Zealand. Whether Kupe existed historically is likely but difficult to confirm. He is generally held to have been born to a father from Rarotonga and a mother from Raiatea, and probably spoke a Proto-Maori language similar to Cook Islands Maori or Tahitian. His voyage to New Zealand would ensure that the land would be known to the Polynesians, and he would therefore be responsible for the genesis of Maori civilization. Kupe features prominently in the mythology and oral history of some Maori iwi, which are tribes, but the details of his life differ between iwi or iwi. Various legends and histories describe Kupe's extensive involvement in the settlement of Aotearoa. That's horrible. I butchered it completely. I apologize. Around 1300 CE, with many talking of his achievements, such as the hunting and destruction of the great octopus, Te Wiki a Muturangi. Horrible. I apologize there. Alrighty, moving on. So, it's a myth, basically. Like, there's no actual data or historical. It's not historically accurate. Like, so it's basically at this point an invention from the British, which again doesn't surprise me at all. But they call it the Great New Zealand Myth. All right.
Traditional Maori ethnographers have long traced their ancestry back to around 1300. And in recent years, there has been much evidence for this, not the earlier date. Analysis of rat DNA, stowaways aboard ocean-going vessels that arrived in New Zealand at the same time as the first people, suggests that there may have in fact been multiple colonizations around this time, though it remains near impossible to pinpoint exactly where these voyagers first landed, with varying different theories existing from north to south. It's even possible that some of the canoe journeys mythologized by later descendants might have actually begun within New Zealand itself, with clans travelling to a different part of the islands in order to find the best land and resources. One of the most tantalising clues found in recent years is a pearl shell fish lure found at Turua on the eastern side of the Coromandel Peninsula, dating from the late 13th century. Was this item made by one of the first people in New Zealand? Genetic and archaeological evidence at the Wairau Bar site at the north of the South Island suggests a date of around 1280 for the Polynesian arrival. The fact that some Polynesian crops obviously survived the crossing does suggest that at least some of the initial settlers arrived somewhere on the North Island, or at least made their initial base here. Any further south and the crops simply wouldn't survive, for this was a much colder land than they were used to. Of the 8 root crops and 11 plant crops found in Polynesia, only 6 would grow in New Zealand. If they had brought chicken and pig with them too, they soon died out, leaving only dogs and rats as introduced species. the bountiful coconut, secret to Polynesian success on the Pacific, and the trusty banana tree could not grow in this temperate climate. Even the Kumara sweet potato could only be grown with significant effort under highly favourable conditions. Yet, nonetheless, they, more so than any of their ancestors, had hit the jackpot. With 18,000 kilometres of coastline to explore, filled with seemingly inexhaustible amounts of food, and textiles in the form of the hardy flax plant, abundant and widespread in wetlands, which provided essential material for garments, baskets, mats, cordage, and much else. Fish and crustaceans were abundant. Seals and sea lions lounged by the shore. Never having encountered humans before, they were easy pickings. Colossal whales even beached themselves from time to time, no doubt feeding entire communities and, in time, forming a major part of Maori mythology. But it was inland where the greatest prizes of all could be found, for those daring enough to go searching. Just like in Australia, mammals, as we know them anyway, never made it to New Zealand. But unlike Australia, where marsupials developed instead, New Zealand's birds became the apex animals, filling all of the niches their mammalian cousins would usually fill in the rest of the world. Some 378 species of them, many of which cannot be found anywhere else on Earth. The most iconic of these avian species must surely be the moa, colossal flightless birds that developed in isolation without the risk of mammalian predators. They spent their lives wandering peacefully around the forest floor and, of course, made easy targets for hungry people. And in time, their staple diet. The Wairo Bar excavations revealed a world moulded by the moa. The people here used moa eggshells to carry water, and their bones for the manufacture of fish hooks, harpoons, and ornaments. At the mouth of the Waitaki River, anywhere between 29,000 to 90,000 individual specimens have been found. Further south, at the mouth of the Shag River, at least 6,000 moa were slaughtered in a very short space of time. Recently discovered cave paintings hint at this long gone by time, when humans and megafauna lived side by side. Though archaeology hints at other beasts too. For prior to the human arrival, the moa had just one predator, another animal that grew larger and larger over millions of years in mirroring its prey. With vertebrae the size of a child's head, the Haast's eagle was the largest predatory eagle ever to soar through the skies. And it is very likely that for a brief time it developed a taste for human flesh. Though intriguingly, moa seem to have not survived in Maori legend. The Haast's eagle certainly does. In mythological tales from the South to the North Island, all birds are winged, and many are carnivorous. With few alternative sources of food as easy to acquire as moa, who had no fear of humans, New Zealand's newly arrived Polynesian people quickly grew accustomed to killing and eating them. Within a century, all of the slow-breeding moa, along with their predators, were gone forever. It had been the same all over the world in places where animals were not used to humans. In Australia, South America, and even with the mammoths of Europe. Slow-breeding megafauna simply would not survive after fast-breeding and intelligent tool-using humans entered an area. Though eventually Maori would be forced to adopt a largely vegetarian diet, those early settlers lived in a land of plenty, with enough meat to go around. Protein is excellent for fertility, meaning the population would have increased very quickly.
Wow, so human beings went in and... That bird didn't survive. That bird and its own predator as well. Prey and predator, both. Human beings came out, they were hungry. Gotta eat somehow. It's interesting how he also, the narrator also mentions, great documentary, by the way. Like, excellent documentary. Shout out to the content creator. Very well made, very informative. I've learned quite a lot today. I like the fact that the narrator mentioned that same situation happening in other parts of the world as well. You know, like with the mammoths in Europe, happened in South America. And that the explanation that it's when human beings occupy land where animals have never seen human beings, those animals are the ones that tend to go extinct because humans are hungry. They gotta eat somehow. And the Maori people discovered a land filled with, this meat and this, flourishing land and whatnot, and they ate it all. To the point where now the narrator explained that they had to go largely vegetarian because, the species had to survive somehow, but they went through all the meat, so I guess the next best thing is fruits and vegetables. Moving on. I appreciate everyone being here. Thank you very much.
With geneticists and demographers arguing that a starting population of just 100 to 200 people could easily have increased to 100,000 by the 18th century, given the massive boost provided by the mower. Archaeological evidence suggests that those early settlers, whether they arrived on just a handful of canoes or many more, had explored all of the islands by the 14th century, even visiting the remotest areas of Fiordland. And they weren't finished either. Some groups may have left New Zealand entirely to attempt to settle the Norfolk Islands, to get to a way station on Pitcairn, on Raoul Island in the Kermadaks, and certainly the Chatham Islands, where a distinct group known as the Maori developed, the real origin of that earlier New Zealand myth of two Maori tribes. The initial colonial period lasted for around 100 to 150 years, after which time the slow-breeding moa were pretty much all dead, in most areas leading to a complete revolutionising of society, and the roots of later Maori culture to come. On the South Island, many groups entered a mass migration to better climes on the north, and evidence exists of a great cataclysmic fire that tore across the islands towards the end of this period. Perhaps this was a last attempt to root out any surviving moa by desperate people. Maybe it was slash and burn style agriculture, such as happened all over the world in ancient times, for example in Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe. No Polynesian settler would have wanted to kill every single moa, nor did they realise that's what they were doing, the effects of which ended their world. Yet, for better or for worse, the damage was done, and they would have to live with the consequences. From then on, going it alone. A new age had dawned, an era of man.
Alright, so it's a long white cloud, circa 1450 to 1779.
On a misty dawn morning in December 1642, 121 days out of the port city of Jakarta, 2 Dutch trading vessels sailing on behalf of the Dutch East India Company in order to search out the long hypothesized continent of Terra Australis, sighted land upon the horizon. Heading due east from Mauritius, across entirely uncharted waters, Abel Tasman's boats had managed to completely miss Australia, but land they found nonetheless. On the morning of the 17th, they saw smoke rising from the shore, the unmistakable sign of people. What happened next exists only in the Dutch records. The Maori themselves who took part have no voice in this tale, themselves being wiped out by invading musket-wielding North Islanders in the early 19th century. Though recent archaeological research has shown that Tasman's ships probably arrived at a major agricultural area. According to the ship's records, as Tasman's men rowed to shore to collect water, 2 double-headed canoes packed with Maori in turn came out to inspect them. Having no idea of the complicated, time-honoured etiquette of Maori meeting rituals, Tasman's men unwittingly launched into what must have seemed to the natives like a challenge, returning a trumpet horn and shouting to the assembled Maori warriors, who promptly attacked, ramming Tasman's boat and killing several of the terrified Dutchmen. Shots were fired from both sides, and as Tasman eventually sailed out of the bay, he observed 22 more war canoes near the shore, 11 of which swarmed with warriors eager to fight. Tasman's instructions had been clear: to not engage the natives. He promptly left, never to return, but not before naming the place Murderer's Bay. The body of at least one deceased Dutchman does seem to have been taken ashore, possibly to be cooked and eaten, in order for his mana, a sort of spiritual capital, often translated as prestige or authority, to be absorbed by the victors. Whether they realised it or not, those Maori had got off lightly. Disease didn't get into the islands at this time. And Europeans wouldn't be back for over 120 years to come. They didn't realise it either, but Tasman's crew had just come into contact with their first taste of the complex traditions of Maori life. For mana wasn't the only concept to play a huge part in society. Utu, often seen as a sort of eye for an eye revenge, is far more complicated than that. It is an obligation for reciprocity, not simply negative but positive too. For example, a leading warrior is obliged by tradition to return a gift as much as he is an attack. The breaking of taboo, such as trespassing in a holy area, was tantamount to treason and a death sentence. The roots of this elaborate system of mutual respect between groups lies in the mysterious 14th and 15th centuries, usually seen as a transitional time wherein the Maori became less nomadic, settling down in defined territories and beginning to form associations based on kinship and tribal affiliation, many of which claimed descent from one of those first canoes to land on the islands. This desire to put down roots may have come about partly as a result of the harsh adjustments people had been forced to make to their lifestyles following a massive population increase and ensuing demise of the megafauna of New Zealand. It's even possible that certain Maori groups collectively learned from this experience, choosing to not hunt as many of the remaining birds afterwards, and continuing to foster wide-ranging trade networks between areas with access to differing foodstuffs. Thus, Maori not only survived, but flourished by expanding and intensifying their remaining sources of food production. With the exception of the South Island, which remained sparsely populated and fishing reigned supreme, gardening became especially important. Horticulture perhaps providing half of the food of the islands by the 18th century. Foraging too remained important, with many trees and forests becoming partially domesticated, acting as a garden much like the ancient Amazon rainforest. It wasn't just food that was traded either. By the 15th century, South Island Maori were exporting greenstone to the rest of the islands on an industrial scale. Settlers in the Bay of Plenty on the North Island oversaw the distribution of volcanic obsidian to far-flung shores. And Nelson residents at the north of the South Island quarried and distributed argillite. A variety of foodstuffs, only readily available in certain areas, would also be stored and bartered with other tribes. Thus, though the great ocean-going canoes had disappeared by the 18th century, extensive use of waka still remained to travel across lakes, rivers and coasts, from the north to the south to trade their wares. Thus, by the time Europeans arrived in New Zealand...
Yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting, Yunin, as well. The word taboo derives from the Maori word tapu. It's very interesting. Dude, knowledge is power. The more you know, the better.
Every possible societal niche had been utilised, and an incredibly complex series of states born. This was the last major community in the world to be untouched by globalisation. On the Chatham Islands, to New Zealand's east, where resources were scarce and the population remained small, as a testament to the power of human adaptability, warfare and violence in general was outlawed. On New Zealand, the population was simply too large to put anything like this in place. But complicated checks and balances did exist to stop any one power from overcoming the others. New Zealand had arguably a more complex and extensive culture than anywhere else in Polynesia. Throughout the 15th century, as the Maori population continued to grow, increased competition for resources not only led to tribal organisations, but warfare. A general culture of competitiveness meant that there was constant need to be vigilant. Sometimes tribes would come together to federate, other times they would fight each other in a shifting patchwork of allegiances. It may be that this system eventually emigrated to the South Island, where people still lived a nomadic existence for longer, perhaps via invading tribes. Eventually, certain groups would build massive fortresses, partly to stake claims on the land, partly as meeting places, and refuges to flee to in times of war. It was here that Maori warriors made their stands against the British in the land wars of the 1860s. These fortresses, known as pa, were elaborately constructed, with ditches, banks, palisades, and usually an interior stronghold. Near impregnable to sieges in pre-European times, and in themselves a way of avoiding warfare. Yet living in these pas wasn't usually a permanent way of life. They were there for emergencies in times of war, which...
Really quickly, so Land Wars, or New Zealand Wars, took place from 1845 to 1872 between the New Zealand colonial government and allied Maori on one side and Maori allied settlers on the other. They were previously commonly referred to as the Land Wars or the Maori Wars, while Maori language names for the conflicts included the Great New Zealand Wars. It's too difficult for me to I don't want to be disrespectful. And the White Man's Anger. Historian James Bellick popularized the name New Zealand Wars in the 1980s. Although, according to Vincent O'Malley, the term was first used by historian James Cohen in the 1920s. Though the wars were initially localized conflicts triggered by tensions over disputed land purchases, they escalated dramatically from 1860 as the government became convinced it was facing united Maori resistance to further land sales and a refusal to acknowledge crown sovereignty. The colonial government summoned thousands of British troops to mount major campaigns to overpower the Maori King movement, and also conquest of farming and residential lands for British settlers. Later campaigns were aimed at quashing the so-called movement, an extremist part of the Maori religion, which was strongly opposed to the conquest of Maori lands and eager to strengthen Maori identity. At the peak of the hostilities in the 1860s, 18,000 British Army troops, supported by artillery, cavalry, and local militia, battled about 4,000 Maori warriors, and what would become a gross imbalance of manpower and weaponry. Although outnumbered, the Maori were able to withstand their enemy with techniques that included anti-artillery bunkers and the use of carefully placed pa, or fortified villages, that allowed them to block their enemy's advance and often inflict heavy losses, yet quickly abandon their positions without significant loss. Guerrilla-style tactics were used by both sides in later campaigns, often fought in dense bush. Over the course of Taranaki and Waikato campaigns, the lives of about 1,800 Maori and 800 Europeans were lost, and total Maori losses over the course of all the wars have exceeded 2,100. Violence over land ownership broke out first in the Wairau Valley in the South Island in June 1843, but rising tensions in Taranaki eventually led to the involvement of British military forces at Waitara in March 1860. The war between the government and Kintitanga Maori spread to other areas of North Island, with the biggest single campaign being the invasion of Waikato in 1863 to 1864, before hostilities concluded with the pursuit of Rewa Titokowaru in Taranaki, 1868 to 1869, and Rangatira Te Kuti Ari Kirangi on the East Coast, 1868 to 1872. I butchered it. I feel horrible. I apologize. I tried my hardest. Just know that I tried my hardest in saying those names. But yeah, just wanted to read a little bit about the Land Wars. Very interesting. Because remember, and I'll repeat it again, knowledge is power.
Would come and go. For example, when Cook and his men arrived in 1769, they found Maori living extremely differing lifestyles, noting that whilst some lived in perfect peace and harmony, presumably having already been assured of peace by the diplomacy of Tupaia, others seemed to be in a constant state of war, having taken up residence in their ancient hill fort complexes. We now know that it was probably Cook's very arrival which precipitated this temporary lifestyle change. Traditionally, warfare probably only took place in the summer months, and populations largely remained unaffected by it, with only hand-to-hand weapons available. Tribal groups would seldom be able to overcome their rivals entirely. Skilled warriors were, of course, highly prized members of society, but there were many other aspects of life too. Prior to the arrival of Europeans, Maori enjoyed a deep spiritual connection with the world they inhabited. Tohunga, a sort of priestly class, sometimes called chosen ones, acted as intermediaries between humankind and the spirit world. They knew how to utilize the forces of nature, primarily in order to invoke protection and to heal, though in some circumstances they were said to have used black magic to bring misfortune on their enemies. Flax, a fibre crop, was an invaluable resource for everyday life. Weaving from flax was a career reserved for the women of the tribe, many becoming master craftspeople in their own right. Tattooing, a tradition widespread throughout the Pacific Islands, became more and more elaborate and unique as time went on. An intricate system of storytelling plastered right onto the skin, each design a different chapter in the book. Tattooists were greatly admired, though another art form, wood carving, in time became perhaps the most sought-after skill of all, and one which during the course of the transitional 15th century would distinguish Maori from their East Polynesian forebears. This was very much a career reserved for master craftsmen, experts who would spend their entire lives in enhancing the mana of their entire community through the representation of deities and the spirits of the ancestors. These intricate motifs, somewhat reminiscent of animal art styles found all over the earth, would be placed wherever they could be, on doors, houses, canoes, weapons, staffs, and trinkets. Nevertheless, this was an incredibly harsh life. To live to around 30 was probably the life expectancy. To live to 50 was exceptional. Tupaia wasn't the only Polynesian islander to accompany Cook on his missions to New Zealand. An interpreter named Hiti Hiti accompanied him on his second mission, and Omai on the third. In the space of many years and many meetings with Maori, these men successfully communicated to their cousins that a far larger world existed outside of their own. And of course, this knowledge lit a fire of curiosity within many of their hearts. Omai had even visited England. Of course, upon hearing of this wider world, many Maori wished to travel with Cook away from their islands to see these wonders for themselves. It is in this context that in the 1770s, an adventurous young man named Te Wararu and his even younger relative Koa simply wouldn't accept no for an answer from Cook, eventually accompanying their new friend and mentor Omai to the Cook Islands, Tonga, and eventually to the Societies, where their ancestors may have first colonised New Zealand from some 400 years before. There is a sad end to this tale. Like so many Polynesians over the century to come, all three men died within a few years, before ever returning to New Zealand. The 19th and the 20th centuries were not kind to Maori. Epidemics and a general loss of their place in the world led to a steep decline in population until around 1900. despite fighting admirably on the front lines for the British during the First and Second World Wars. Until very recently, endemic societal disadvantages and governmental laws kept them in a state of second-class citizenship, a situation the nation is still struggling to overcome today. Only time will tell what the future holds.
And it's, you know what really bothers me a lot is that it's a shared sentiment in places that, in countries that have indigenous populations. Dude, they're treated like garbage. Like they want to take their lands, and like that sucks. That only comes to show that colonizing conquer mentality is still alive and well. It's just that it's disguised now, and it has a different mask because it has to assimilate itself into our current times. But you see it all across the news, and it happens all the time, and it's indigenous people losing rights, losing their homes, losing their lands. It's happening in Brazil. I mean, and hopefully now with Lula there, it can go back to, indigenous people having rights. Or having like their lands back and stuff, or not having to live in fear of having their lands taken from them. Like, there's still indigenous tribes in like the Amazons, like deep in the Amazons. Still indigenous tribes all around the world. I mean, and it's like it's how this capitalist system has made us believe that we are like a step above them, or whatever the case may be, without ever realizing that, they are truly free, as opposed to whatever situation we find ourselves in right now, because of obviously the capitalist system that a lot of these countries in this world, including the one I'm in right now, seem to want to direct themselves with. That's how they live their whole thing with this capitalist, capitalist system, and there's the rich and the poor and all this crap, and yeah. My point is that it's an like the narrator said, it's an ongoing problem that's still happening to this day. It sucks. So we're going into 2023 and we're still dealing with this. It's crazy. Quite amazing. Shout out to that content creator. That was a great documentary. I learned a whole lot. New Zealand has a lot of history. And that land war, like the whole thing, like the treaty that we talked about, the land war. You're welcome, Unit. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Knowledge is power. That's the key. That's the trick right there. I'll be honest with you. I love this so much that it's changing it's changing my way of thinking, my way of seeing life, and I'm so grateful to the universe that I have the opportunity to be able to do this, and that I get to spend time with you and engage and learn and chat, and it's my happy place. It fills my heart with joy. I appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. This was This was a very, very awesome episode. We will be rating Government Cheese 420. I hope everyone has a great Saturday. Have a great weekend. I'll see you on Wednesday for True Crime and Murder Mystery. Just remember to join the Discord. become a Patreon member for $2 a month. You can find me on all social media. All these links you can find in the About section. Check out my work. Check out my YouTube channel. Subscribe. Check out my reaction videos. And let's start this raid. You guys have a very wonderful day. This is the King Angel Show. Peace.